Evelyn Carter had already accepted the verdict. Every expert who examined the car agreed that her rare $200,000 Mustang was beyond saving. A beautiful shell with a dead heart, the restoration impossible, and the value reduced to little more than nostalgia sitting on four flat tires. She was ready to let it go, to sell the wreck for scrap and move on with her life, the way she moved on from every failed investment, quickly and without looking back. But something made her make one final stop at a tiny garage owned by a quiet single father on the edge of town. He did not start the engine. He did not run a single diagnostic. He simply lifted the hood, leaned in close, and froze. Hidden beneath 5 decades of grease and grime was a forgotten factory code that nobody had noticed in 50 years. The garage sat 2 hours outside Charlotte, North Carolina, at the end of a gravel road lined with oak trees on a Thursday morning in April. No sign hung above the bay door. No advertisement of any kind faced the road. Daniel Brooks was 40 years old, a widower raising an 11-year-old daughter alone, and he had not taken a new client in over a year. Evelyn was 38, and she had built an electric vehicle company worth $4.3 billion out of nothing. She had paid $200,000 for the Mustang at a private auction 6 weeks earlier, certain it would be worth close to $1 million once restored. Instead, 3 separate restoration shops, each considered among the best in the state, had told her the same thing in the same flat tone. The engine was seized beyond repair, the frame had rusted through in places no weld could safely fix, and the vehicle identification number stamped into the chassis matched no record in the manufacturer's official archive, a detail one appraiser called a red flag serious enough to make the entire car worthless as anything but scrap metal. A local paper had already run the story. Her board had already started asking questions that had nothing to do with car engines and everything to do with her judgment. She had one last name. An archivist named Ruth had given it to her the night before, almost as an afterthought. Daniel Brooks, 2 hours outside the city, a man who saw things other people missed. Evelyn stood in the doorway of his garage now, watching him lean over the open hood in complete silence, one hand resting near the firewall, his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. He had been quiet for 6 minutes. She counted every one of them. And then he asked her a question nobody else had thought to ask in 6 weeks, a question about a single bolt near the firewall that looked, to her untrained eye, exactly like every other bolt beside it. 3 years before Evelyn Carter ever found his garage, Daniel Brooks was standing in a school parking lot at 7:45 in the morning, waiting for the office to open so he could ask again for 1 more week to pay his daughter's field trip fee. His daughter's name was Maggie. She was 11 years old, quick with numbers, and she had inherited her mother's habit of asking questions that had no easy answer. Daniel's wife had died 4 years earlier, a car accident on a wet road 11 miles from their house, and since then it had been just the 2 of them in a small rented house behind the garage with a truck that needed a transmission Daniel never had time to fix because he was always fixing someone else's car first. He opened the garage at 6 every morning and closed it whenever the last job was finished, sometimes 9 at night, sometimes later. He charged less than every shop in the county, not because he didn't know what his work was worth, but because most of his customers were people who couldn't afford anywhere else. A retired mill worker with a truck older than his own daughter, a nurse working night shifts who needed her car running by 6 a.m. or she lost a full day's pay. He never once raised a price on someone he knew was struggling, even if it meant he came up short himself. He had turned down 2 offers over the years to work at dealership service centers in Charlotte, jobs that paid steady salaries with benefits and set hours, jobs that would have meant health insurance for Maggie and a mechanic's pension waiting at the end of it. He turned both down for the same reason. He didn't want someone else deciding which cars mattered and which didn't. He wanted to look at a car himself, decide if it deserved saving, and then save it properly or not touch it at all. People in town knew him as reliable, quiet, a little strange in the way he'd stand over an engine for 20 minutes without touching a tool. Nobody in Charlotte's restoration circles knew him at all. He didn't advertise, didn't attend the swap meets where reputations were built, didn't correct anyone who assumed a man in a stained work shirt running a 1-bay garage behind his own house was simply a mechanic and nothing more. That Thursday morning, before Evelyn Carter's Mustang ever arrived on a flatbed, Daniel had already been up since 5, first making sure Maggie's lunch was packed, then walking her the 4 blocks to the school bus stop himself, the same as he did every single morning, rain or clear sky, because it was the only 20 minutes of the day that belonged only to the two of them. He had no idea, walking back toward the garage that morning, that within the hour a black car would pull up the gravel road carrying a woman worth more money than his entire town combined, and the bolt he was about to notice, quietly, without a word to anyone, would change everything he had built his life around protecting. Daniel noticed the bolt before he noticed anything else about the car, and it took him exactly 11 seconds. He had lifted the hood the way he always did, slow, both hands, no rush, and let his eyes move across the engine bay the same methodical path his father had taught him 30 years earlier. Top left, down the firewall, across the block, back along the manifold. It was a habit so old he no longer thought about it consciously. But 11 seconds in, his eyes stopped on a single fastener near the firewall, and something in the back of his mind refused to let him move past it. Every other bolt in that engine bay wore the same 50 years of oxidation, the same dull corrosion that came from 5 decades sitting untouched. This one didn't. The threading caught the light differently. The wear pattern was wrong. "Who replaced this bolt?" he asked without looking up. Evelyn stepped closer, studying the same fastener he was pointing to, and saw nothing. To her eye, it looked identical to the 20 bolts surrounding it. "I have no idea," she admitted. "Nobody's ever asked me that. 3 different shops looked at this car and not one of them mentioned a bolt." Daniel didn't answer right away. He crouched lower, closer to the firewall, and ran his thumb along the metal beside it, feeling for a texture rather than looking for one. Then he asked for a flashlight, and when Evelyn's assistant produced one from the car, he angled the beam low across the surface instead of straight into it, the way a man looks for footprints in morning frost rather than at noon. This was replaced sometime after the car was originally built. Not recently, but not from the factory either. He didn't say anything more that day. He spent the rest of the afternoon simply looking, not touching, moving a folding stool from one side of the engine to the other, occasionally making a small note in a spiral pad he kept in his back pocket. Evelyn found herself standing at the edge of the garage for nearly 3 hours, watching a man do almost nothing at all, and somehow feeling more hopeful than she had in 6 weeks of expensive, decisive, confident diagnoses from men who talked a great deal and found nothing. By the second day, Daniel had cataloged 4 more inconsistencies. A layer of paint beneath the visible paint on the inner fender well, which made no sense on a standard production line. A weld near the seam of the firewall, small, precise, tucked into a place no standard factory weld belonged. A threading pattern on one bolt that, as far as he could recall from years of studying old parts catalogs with his father, hadn't existed commercially until several years after this particular Mustang was supposedly manufactured. None of it was dramatic. None of it looked to an untrained eye like anything worth mentioning at all. That was exactly what troubled him. He called Victor Hale directly, the appraiser who had already pronounced the car worthless in the newspaper, and asked him to come look at the paint layer and the weld himself before any further decisions were made about scrapping the vehicle. Victor agreed, mostly out of professional curiosity about who this unknown mechanic even was, and arrived 2 days later in a pressed shirt, moving through the garage with the easy confidence of a man who had never been once wrong in front of a client. He glanced at the weld for maybe 4 seconds. "That's an aftermarket repair. Somebody patched a corrosion spot decades ago. It happens on cars this old constantly. It means nothing." Daniel said nothing back. He simply nodded once, the way a man nods when he has decided not to argue, but has also decided not to change his mind. And Evelyn, watching the exchange from across the garage, felt something tighten quietly in her chest. She had brought in 3 experts already and paid each of them tens of thousands of dollars in consulting fees, and every one of them had reached a fast, confident, and definitive verdict within a single afternoon. Daniel Brooks had been looking at this car for 2 days and had reached no verdict at all. He had only reached more questions. That evening, after Victor left, Daniel stood alone at the workbench with the flashlight angled low across the fender well again, running his fingers slowly along that hidden second layer of paint, the way he might read a page of Braille. He said nothing to Evelyn about what he suspected. He wasn't ready to. But he stayed at the garage 3 hours past when he normally would have gone home to make Maggie dinner. And when he finally did leave, he carried the spiral notepad with him, tucked into his jacket pocket, instead of leaving it on the bench the way he usually did.
This was replaced sometime after the car was originally built, he said. Not recently, but not from the factory either. He didn't say anything more that day. He spent the rest of the afternoon simply looking, not touching, moving a folding stool from one side of the engine to the other, occasionally making a small note in a spiral pad he kept in his back pocket. Evelyn found herself standing at the edge of the garage for nearly 3 hours, watching a man do almost nothing at all, and somehow feeling more hopeful than she had in 6 weeks of expensive, decisive, confident diagnoses from men who talked a great deal and found nothing. By the second day, Daniel had cataloged 4 more inconsistencies. A layer of paint beneath the visible paint on the inner fender well, which made no sense on a standard production line. A weld near the seam of the firewall, small, precise, tucked into a place no standard factory weld belonged. A threading pattern on one bolt that, as far as he could recall from years of studying old parts catalogs with his father, hadn't existed commercially until several years after this particular Mustang was supposedly manufactured. None of it was dramatic. None of it looked, to an untrained eye, like anything worth mentioning at all. That was exactly what troubled him. He called Victor Hale directly, the appraiser who had already pronounced the car worthless in the newspaper, and asked him to come look at the paint layer and the weld himself before any further decisions about scrapping the vehicle. Victor agreed, mostly out of professional curiosity about who this unknown mechanic even was, and arrived 2 days later in a pressed shirt, moving through the garage with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been wrong in front of a client. He glanced at the weld for maybe 4 seconds. That's an aftermarket repair. Somebody patched a corrosion spot decades ago. It happens on cars this old constantly. It means nothing. Daniel said nothing back. He simply nodded once, the way a man nods when he has decided not to argue, but has also decided not to change his mind. And Evelyn, watching the exchange from across the garage, felt something tighten quietly in her chest. She had brought in 3 experts already and paid each of them tens of thousands of dollars in consulting fees, and every one of them had reached a fast, confident, definitive verdict within a single afternoon. Daniel Brooks had been looking at this car for 2 days and had reached no verdict at all. He had only reached more questions. That evening, after Victor left, Daniel stood alone at the workbench with the flashlight angled low across the fender well again, running his fingers slowly along that hidden second layer of paint, the way he might read a page of Braille. He said nothing to Evelyn about what he suspected. He wasn't ready to. But he stayed at the garage 3 hours past when he normally would have gone home to make Maggie dinner, and when he finally did leave, he carried the spiral notepad with him, tucked into his jacket pocket instead of leaving it on the bench the way he usually did. Victor Hale's confidence only grew the following week. He returned twice more, each time with a slightly more polished explanation for every detail Daniel had flagged. The paint layer beneath the fender well was simply a manufacturing defect from a rushed production year, he said, something he'd seen on a dozen other Mustangs from that same era. The unusual weld was almost certainly a corrosion patch from some previous owner decades ago, the kind of amateur repair that showed up constantly on cars this old. And the threading pattern, he explained to Evelyn directly, standing in her own corporate office with a folder of comparison photographs spread across her desk, was well within the range of acceptable variation for a 50-year-old vehicle that had passed through God knows how many hands before hers. He said all of this with the same flat, practiced certainty he'd used in the newspaper weeks earlier, and this time he brought supporting documentation, 3 pages of citations from restoration manuals, photographs of similar bolts from similar Mustangs, a chart comparing paint chemistry across several production years. It was, by any reasonable measure, a thorough and professional presentation. Evelyn's board found it reassuring. 2 directors told her privately that continuing to fund an unknown mechanic's investigation when the region's most credentialed appraiser had now twice confirmed there was nothing unusual about the car made her look worse, not better. One board member suggested gently that perhaps it was time to sell the vehicle for whatever scrap value remained and let the story fade.
Evelyn sat through the meeting without arguing. But that night, she drove out to Daniel's garage again, the gravel crunching under her tires in the dark, and found him still there, alone, the bay light on, a magnifying lamp angled over the small stamped symbol near the base of the engine block he hadn't yet mentioned to anyone. "Victor says it's nothing," she told him. Daniel didn't look up. "I know what he says." "Do you think he's wrong?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying the symbol under the lamp. "He thinks," he said finally, "that he's looking at what the car is supposed to be. I'm trying to figure out what it actually is." Daniel found the symbol on a Tuesday, half buried under grime near the base of the engine block, small enough that he almost dismissed it himself the first time his flashlight passed over it. It wasn't a manufacturer's stamp he recognized. He'd spent 20 years studying Mustang production sheets the way other men studied stock charts, and this mark matched nothing in any catalog he owned. He photographed it, sketched it twice in his notepad, and said nothing to Evelyn for 2 full days while he tried and failed to place it. The third night, he drove to the public library 2 towns over to a small archive room dedicated to regional automotive manufacturing history. He'd been there before, as a boy, sitting beside his father on quiet Saturday afternoons while his father searched through old service bulletins for parts nobody made anymore. The librarian on duty, a woman nearing retirement, recognized him immediately and unlocked a back cabinet she didn't open for the general public. He sat there past midnight, sliding through boxes of yellowed blueprints nobody had touched in years. Deep in a folder of old engineering notes, tucked between reports on tire pressure standards, he found fragments of something that had never made it into any official record. References to a small, secretive engineering team that had once built a handful of experimental vehicles meant to test technology considered too advanced to release publicly. Those cars were never supposed to leave company grounds. At least one, according to a single line in a cramped, hurried hand, had disappeared from inventory without explanation. Daniel drove back to the garage before sunrise, exhausted, and stood in front of the Mustang with a certainty settling over him that he didn't want to say out loud yet. The proportions matched, the era matched, the hidden weld matched exactly what those notes had described in careful, evasive language. This wasn't simply a rare Mustang bought for $200,000. It might be the one vehicle collectors had quietly searched for and never found for 50 years. The following morning, Daniel asked Evelyn to clear the garage of everyone except the 2 of them. He worked slowly, unbolting a thin metal shielding plate beneath the engine block, a component so ordinary in appearance that 3 separate inspection teams and Victor Hale himself had walked past it without a second glance. It took him nearly 20 minutes to loosen the last bolt, his hands steady despite what he suspected he might find underneath.
Behind the plate was a hollow compartment carved directly into the frame with obvious precision, built into the vehicle during manufacturing rather than added later by some hobbyist or thief. Evelyn stood beside him, her heart moving faster than it had during any negotiation of her career, as Daniel reached into the darkness with careful, patient hands. There was no gold, no stacks of currency. What he pulled out was a small sealed steel box, dented along one corner, but otherwise remarkably intact for something that had spent 50 years hidden from daylight. He set it gently on the workbench and worked the rusted latch open with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow preserved its contents, were folded documents, hand-drawn engineering blueprints, annotated in soft pencil, showing modifications years ahead of anything publicly available at the time the car was built. An official certification confirming the vehicle as an authentic factory prototype, a separate slip listing a production code that appeared in no standard manufacturing archive Daniel had ever encountered, and beneath it all, a personal letter, folded with obvious care, written in looping handwriting by someone who understood exactly what they were sealing away. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Evelyn read the certification twice before she trusted her own eyes. "This isn't scrap," Daniel said quietly. "This never was." Word moved fast once Martin Graves, a longtime collector who'd been observing the restoration from a respectful distance for weeks, leaned over the certification stamp and went pale. He recognized it immediately, a mark he'd only ever heard whispered about at collectors' gatherings, never confirmed by anyone who'd actually seen it in person. Within hours, the restoration community knew. Within days, serious collectors from across the country were calling Evelyn's office directly, requesting private viewings of a car everyone had assumed, only weeks earlier, was destined to a scrapyard. Victor Hale, reached by a reporter for comment, offered no rebuttal this time. He asked only one question: how a man nobody in the industry had ever heard of had found what 50 years of professionals had missed entirely.
The letter answered the question the entire industry was suddenly asking. Written in the same looping hand as the certification, it explained what Daniel had already begun to suspect from the archive notes. This Mustang was the final surviving prototype from a discontinued experimental engineering program built to secretly test a high-performance engine configuration decades ahead of anything the company was willing to release commercially at the time. Rather than destroy every trace of a canceled program, someone inside the factory had made a quiet, deliberate choice to preserve one single vehicle, disguising it as an ordinary production model before releasing it into the world, where it would sit unnoticed among thousands of nearly identical cars for half a century. The letter didn't name that person, but it made clear the decision had been dangerous, made without authorization by someone who understood exactly what they were risking to keep the work from disappearing entirely. Auction houses that had refused to list the vehicle when it was scrap now called Evelyn directly, asking for the chance to handle what had become one of the most significant automotive discoveries in decades. She insisted on a public auction rather than a private sale, and the news outlets that had mocked her 6 weeks earlier now sent reporters requesting comment on a story they'd already covered once from the opposite direction. Daniel found none of it comfortable. He'd spent his career preferring the quiet of a one-bay garage to any kind of attention, and now photographers were showing up on the gravel road at odd hours, hoping for a glimpse of the car and the mechanic behind it. He asked Evelyn plainly whether all the noise was necessary. She told him she'd shield him from as much of it as she reasonably could, though she also understood, privately, that a discovery this size could never stay contained to one small garage for long. What neither of them expected was Victor Hale showing up at the garage unannounced, standing in the doorway for a long moment before finally speaking.
He didn't come to argue this time. He came to ask, quietly, how Daniel knew where to look when he himself, with 30 years in the field, had walked past every detail without seeing it. Daniel considered the question for a moment before answering. I wasn't looking for what the car was worth. I was looking for what somebody tried to protect. Victor didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, the way a man nods when a truth lands somewhere he isn't ready to say out loud yet, and left without another word. The auction was held publicly, at Evelyn's own assistance, inside a historic hall in Charlotte, packed with collectors, reporters, and people who'd only read about the car in the newspaper weeks earlier. Bidding opened well above what Evelyn had originally paid and climbed steadily, past $5 million, past $8 million, past $11. By the time the gavel came down at $15 million, the entire room had gone quiet before the applause started. It was in that silence that an elderly man began moving slowly through the crowd, leaning on a cane, until he reached the front. His name was Walter Reed, 83 years old. He said he'd once worked as a technician on the very program that built this car, and he'd read about the discovery days earlier and traveled a long way to see with his own eyes whether the rumors were finally true. He confirmed every detail Daniel had pieced together. Company leadership had buried the program rather than release the technology before they were ready. A small group of trusted engineers disguised the final prototype and let it disappear into ordinary circulation so its history would stay protected within a handful of people who understood what they were guarding. Daniel didn't say anything for a long moment. He only nodded, throat tight, understanding finally where his instincts had always come from.
In the weeks after the auction, Evelyn offered Daniel a position as director of an entirely new restoration division within her company, with a salary most independent mechanics never see in a lifetime. He thanked her, thought it over for several days, and turned it down. He had no interest in managing budgets or overseeing a large team, he told her. His satisfaction came from understanding one car at a time, in his own small garage, at his own pace. When she pressed him gently for a real reason, he gave her one she couldn't argue with. If money were what I wanted, he said, I wouldn't have spent 3 sleepless nights in an archive room for a stranger's broken-down car. She thought about that answer for a long time afterward. Over the following months, she found reasons to drive out to the garage more often than any business relationship required, first under the excuse of paperwork, then with no excuse at all. She noticed things about him she'd missed during those first tense weeks, the patient way he explained things without making her feel foolish, the dry humor that slipped out when she least expected it. He noticed in turn a woman who ran boardrooms across the country, but seemed genuinely at ease sitting on an overturned crate, watching him work for hours without checking her phone once. A portion of the $15 million went towards a new foundation for preserving historic American vehicles, one where Daniel retained full authority over which cars the organization chose to protect. He signed the founding papers at his own workbench, said little, and simply thanked her for understanding something about him most people never bothered to notice. At the public unveiling that fall, Walter Reed approached him one last time, drawing a single worn wrench from an old leather satchel. "This belonged to your father," he said. "I kept it safe. I was waiting for the right person to give it to." Daniel took it with both hands, and for a moment his composure wavered completely. Victor Hale, standing near the back of the crowd, offered a quiet, genuine apology before the ceremony ended, for judgments made too fast and with too little humility. Later, as the Mustang rolled down the fairground path under a corridor of autumn trees, engine running exactly as it had been built to run 50 years earlier, Evelyn sat beside Daniel and understood, finally, that some things were never about the money at all, only about who was patient enough to look closely enough to see them.